Hello.
How you doing?
I'm good. I'm calling from the south wing of the house?
Yeah, I'm in the I guess the northeast wing. This is actually where I've done a lot of my music creation in the last number of years.
Yeah. So, just so that the formatting is clear, you get to talk about whatever you want to talk about. It's all recorded and it will not be
All right, we
edited.
got to stop this. You're cutting out really bad. Am I cutting out?
It just did a second ago.
Yeah, you're cutting out so bad I can't even hear what you're saying.
All right.
So we're gonna have to. I'm gonna have to close the door because that echoes weird. But am I cutting out now?
No.
All right. Why don't you stop the recording and we'll start again? I think we just had some internet connections and we'll just ride through it.
Okay.
All right, I'm gonna close the door so I don't have that echo. Can you hear the echo in here?
No.
All right, because you have yours pretty loud out there. I could hear. Okay, so just do the countdown.
How to do this? How do you stop recording? All right, let's see. So I'll do the countdown again, okay?
Okay.
Stop recording. Okay, so we're recording again. Hopefully we won't have any issues this time.
Yep.
I'm wondering if it was because we're in the same house and there was some kind of weird thing. I don't know.
I don't know. We'll give it a shot. See how it goes.
Yeah. Okay, so anyways, to reiterate, you can talk about whatever you want to talk about. There is no editing, so whatever you say will be published. So be mindful of that.
All right. Well, I think maybe a good thing to start with is some plans that we have coming up.
Okay.
I don't think that it's too early to say this, but today is Christmas Eve. First of all, happy holidays
Yes.
to everyone watching. A week from today, there will be a Lycia surprise. There will be an exclusive song put up on Bandcamp.
Right.
It will be a digital only release. It's one song. It's a cover song. It's a cover song of Gary Newman's or Two Boy Army's Our Friends Electric. And I'm pretty excited about it. A little backstory on that is John Fair, who I've been working with on and off since 1982. And starting recently within Flickers, he became pretty involved again. In fact, he was the person that initiated the song of Failure, which is probably Lycia's most popular song at this given moment. But he approached me a few months ago or whatever, and asked me if I was interested in working on this cover with him. And so we worked on it. Just John and I are involved, and it was definitely a trip working on the song. It was fun. That song really meant a lot to me and John both back when we first met in the early 80s. Gary Newman was a massive influence on us. I don't know if people can hear that in Lycia's sound, especially in the early 90s sound, but it was a massive, massive influence. So that will come out on Bandcamp. We're really excited about that. Another thing that we're pretty excited about is some plans that we have for 2021. We're hooking up with Funeral Party Records, a really, really great label.
Super excited about that.
Yeah, a label that I just have tons of respect for.
Yeah.
And we have a couple songs recorded already. And we approached them about the possibility of maybe doing a 7-inch vinyl single. So I think I don't like to use it in worst case scenario, but really it will be minimal, a 7-inch vinyl, but we're really hoping to expand it maybe into a 6-song EP. And I'm pretty excited about that. I don't really want to go too much in it because I want to keep people surprised, but we're going to sort of follow the lead of In Flickers and sort of push ourselves into different territories that maybe people aren't expecting us quite to be in, yet still retain the Lycia sound. So hopefully we can get that going. And if it happens, it will be in the summer. it will happen at least as a 7-inch vinyl, but we're really going to push hard to make it a 6-song EP. Who knows? If it goes, maybe even more.
Yeah, you never know. You never
Yeah,
know.
you don't
John's
know.
pretty prolific, so hopefully at
Yeah.
some point Steve catches on.
Well, I don't. John is a prolific guy, but I don't think it's like the old days when John and I worked together back in the late 80s, in the early days of what is now known as Lycia. We literally worked on music almost every single day, and in a few months, late 88 to early 89, I mean, we probably did about 20 songs and maybe had about 20 other ideas going. It was just flowing. But I work very differently now. I really
Yeah.
I work on every song, and I stretch it out over weeks, sometimes months, just to make sure that everything is right. And so the process is slower now. That's why, it's the end of 2020, and I'm saying we're going to try to get 6 songs by late spring. You just don't know how it goes.
Well, plus things are different. I mean, back then it was like you didn't really have a serious job, and so you didn't have a lot of mental energy taken up by that every day. You didn't have a 9-year-old son. You didn't have a wife and a house and whatever.
Yeah. Another thing that's sort of funny about it is that you would think the logic of having better equipment that you can do more would make things easier, but it's opposite. With the better equipment, now I find that I focus on every little detail of everything.
Yeah.
Back then, we just had a real stripped down setup, and you just would start recording, and if it sounded good, you're like, okay, that's our take, and you just move on to the next song. And
well, and what always cracks me up is you telling me stories about how you guys had all of these demos and you would just record over them.
yeah, that is funny.
All of these amazing songs or whatever that are just gone because you guys were like, oh, I need a tape, and I'll just use this one. Use it again.
Well, just literally a little bit earlier today, going back to the EP that we're potentially working on. John and I are currently right now working on redoing a song from 1989, and it's almost done. So I needed to go and figure out what my lyrics were. So I found an old lyric book just earlier today. I didn't even tell you about this, and I'm looking through the lyrics, and I'm seeing all these songs that are not on our demo page because those demos are gone. Those demos are exactly what you said. They're songs that we recorded over. And even though it's, a couple decades later, I'm looking at these lyrics and I still remember the singing melody, which is sort of bizarre because John and I, the way we worked back then was we wrote a song, it was done, on to the next song. We didn't play live. So a lot of those songs would be really hard to relearn.
Right.
So the fact that I can still remember some of those melodies, it makes me sad that those songs are gone, because if the melodies stuck like that, it must have been decent songs.
Just real quick, for people, if you hear that, people are letting off fireworks and the dog's going crazy.
Yeah.
So just if anybody's listening, it's not gunfire outside.
No, I don't quite understand why Christmas would lead the local hill jacks to set off fireworks. It doesn't make any sense to me. I guess they just want to blow off their own hands on Christmas, but whatever. That's
well, and my question is, if we weren't allowed to go camping and have a campfire in a campfire pit, why are you allowed to set off fireworks? I don't understand the logic of that.
We won't go into the politics of all that. I think we both have a very specific view on all this, but I don't want to use this as the forum of it.
But anyways, what I was gonna say is, so since you and John are recreating one of your old songs, do you think that at any point you might, because you found that notebook, try to recreate any of those other ones?
The missing songs, no, because if we don't have the music, I don't really know what to recreate. But um, this all. I don't think it's possible because time has moved on and everyone's moved on to different directions. But I have to say that a lot of the songs in those early demos really, really resonate with me. I do think that even though they're raw, I do see that era as one of Lycia's high points
Yeah.
with some of the best songs. You know, I can hear through the sloppy recording and the noise, and I can hear what those songs are, and they really are, to me, exceptional songs. And as you remember, going back to the late '90s when we were still in Ohio, I I always wanted to re-record some of the songs,
Yeah.
and so it's a pleasure being able to re-record one of them, and it's a synth-oriented song.
Yeah.
I would love to be able to go back and revisit some of those guitar-based sounds, but I don't know if it's possible for a couple of reasons. One being that John hasn't played bass in probably 20 years, and so um, getting him back reinvested in that might be a little difficult,
Yeah.
understandably so. And likewise, since that time, I've gone through a completely different reinvention of my effects, maybe a half a dozen times.
Oh,
And to go back to my effects setup from that era, which was just a handful of pedals recording into an analog 4-track, it created a specific sound. I don't really know if I could emulate that. And plus, also, there's the whole aspect of,
I'm
there was the spirit of the time frame,
right.
which really sort of emanates from the music, and sometimes you can't recreate
Well,
that. And
I will say, like, for me, one of my favorite Lycia songs is The Lightroom. And it was so cool also that you got to work with Michael Irwin. Like, I love that.
on a Ghost Ascends.
Yeah, and I think it's fun that John's back involved because it's a completely different spirit than like what you would come up with by yourself or whatever.
There's something about working with John. I've worked with John since 1982, and his approach to writing brings out a different type of writing for me than when I work with Dave. Dave brings out a different type of writing, so it's
Right.
really cool. That's what I like about In Flickers. In
Completely
Flickers is
by
my
yourself.
yeah. In Flickers is my favorite Lycia album by far. I think the production of it is everything that I've always wanted in all the other Lycia albums, and I love the fact that Dave came in with some songs, John came in with some songs, and it really dictated what I did with my parts. And then there were songs that I initiated that me and you sort of developed here at home. And they all have this different vibe. And I'm really proud that at the end, it all just flows together, even though stylistically it's all over the place. But in the end, it does sound like a cohesive release. And I'm really proud of it. And I think we're going to continue that variety into hopefully the summer EP, ranging in styles. I mean, I feel free enough to say that one of the styles is straightforward flamenco almost,
Yeah.
and the other song really draws off of almost jazz style guitar, which I've I never really was a big fan, but after hearing David Bowie's Black Star, an album that I think is one of his best albums, I love that album. It might be my favorite David Bowie album, and I've been a fan of his since the early '70s when I was a kid. I love Black Star, and it really led me to approaching the guitar a little bit different, along
Yeah.
with playing some flamenco stuff. So I'm really trying to expand what I'm doing on the guitar and the approach. But I think something that you brought up here is sort of interesting, and you brought up the Light Room and A Ghost Ascends, and that was really fun revisiting those songs because those songs were never recorded. They're just songs that I wrote. Ghost Ascends, I wrote the music of that song in 1983. And I was in a band at the time with Michael. It was sort of a I guess for lack of better words, I usually deny my goth connections, but for the summer of '83, me and Michael were in a goth band called Fields of Shadow.
God.
Let me say this was 1983, so
Right.
we had no idea who Fields of the Nephilim was. I guess the words Fields just lends itself towards goth music, but we were in a goth band, and it was a very short-lasting band. But I wrote that song, brought it in. John was also in that band. He played drums, and we had a song that Michael wrote the lyrics to, and he called it "Ghosts in the Tower." And when we were working on a line that connects, and I decided to do Lightroom, I thought it'd be interesting to also do a remake of Ghosts in the Tower, but Michael couldn't remember his lyrics because it was a long time ago. I don't remember them either. So
Right.
I sort of moved ahead and re-envisioned the song and called it "A Ghost Ascends," and then asked Michael to come and sing backing vocals. And it was a real blast for the past for me because
Well, he's such a cool guy.
yeah, I met Michael in very late 1981. I graduated high school in '81, and I decided that I loved music. I've always loved music, going back to the late '60s when I was a real little kid, and other kids were listening to the Archies, and I was spacing out to "Light My Fire" by the Doors and Jefferson Airplane and "I Can See for Miles" by the Who and stuff like that. And I just went through the standard progression of listening to hard rock, '70s glam rock, art rock, which led me to punk and post-punk. And so, and when I got out of high school, I wanted to be in a band. I had played guitar for like a little over a year, and the first band I formed, Michael was involved, and it probably was somewhere between a moody post-punk band and a quirky new wave band. And we didn't know any better, and we were tight but sort of strange, and we just went out, and Michael was very good at getting us shows. And I don't know, we played probably maybe close to 10 shows that summer, and it was really fun. And so it was really cool. And then after that, because those early days where you'd go from one band to the next, you'd be in a band for 6 months, the band would break up, a couple people would go on to form a new band, then that band would break up, and it just continued for 3 or 4 years. And so I worked with Michael in 3 different bands in the early '80s, and then we lost touch with him. So it was really cool to have him involved again, and reconnecting with the past. And
well, and obviously I never knew him because I was a child.
Wow, it's such a small world though.
2,000 miles away.
Because I mean, we played in a band in Tempe, Arizona, and by the late '80s, he had moved to San Francisco, and John and I were still here in Tempe. And well, I live in Mesa now, but we were in Tempe, and we had our band. And then I met you, and you and Dave moved up to Ohio, where you're from, and we went on tour, and we started our tour in Columbus, Ohio. And little did we know that the club we played at in Columbus, Michael actually was working there.
That still blows my freaking mind.
It was his day off.
Can you imagine if you would have been there?
That would have been a trip. It would have been wild. So small world.
And on top of that, Gordon Sharp is there.
Yep.
I mean,
Gordon Sharp from Cindy Talk and This Mortal Coil. He was living in Columbus at the time, and we're playing the show, and we look out, and there's Gordon Sharp. You talk about the pressure being on.
No kidding. Yeah, no kidding.
Because we were big Cindy Talk fans, and to see someone that you think, wow, this is an amazing guy, and he's watching your show.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, because we had just seen Cindy Talk, maybe a year before that?
I don't know if we saw that before or after. I can't remember. That's a fuzzy time.
We saw them with Trance to the Sun, and then we also saw in Tempe, And
Yeah,
then
we saw
them
them in Tempe after we saw them in Cleveland at a place called Speak in Tongues.
Yeah.
We were very fortunate to see Cindy Talk twice on that tour. We saw them in Cleveland and then Tempe, and in both cases we got to go up and talk to them, and it was pretty cool.
I think the Columbus thing actually happened after that because we were familiar with each other at that point.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's how it was.
Yeah, I can't remember.
How bizarre Michael was there and we didn't see him, but Gordon was there.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So I don't know what I was gonna say. I lost my train.
Any additional things about those early days? I mean, is there anything that you'd want to know about those early days?
So I think it's interesting how different people have like different eras of Lycia or whatever that they like. And a lot of people are really into like that Wake era. And so I think it's probably pretty interesting for them to be able to hear songs from back then that weren't released or that they didn't hear being remade. And then also I think it's funny that like that kind of style is sort of like hip now, I guess. There's a lot of like new goth bands or whatever you want to call them. I don't know what people call themselves anymore, but kind of doing that sound that you guys were doing clear back then. And so I think it's funny because I remember with the last album, there was some kind of, oh, this is different, for Lycia. And it really wasn't. It's actually more normal because of the history there.
Well, this is actually something that is quite interesting because, in the bigger picture from the casual person that listens to the band, Wake is the beginning, but Wake really isn't the beginning. Wake, to a certain degree, is the end. It's the end of the 80s. I started playing in 1981, and I played in maybe a half a dozen bands between 81 and 87. But behind the scenes in those bands, I had something that was always sort of as a sort of an inside joke in the band. It was my side and my solo project. I remember telling people very early on when I started in my very first band that I had this goal of having a band that sounded like intros and breaks. Now, you listen to a song like Dumb Waiters by Psychedelic Furs, and at the end gets all spacey, like the spacey ending, or the end of In a Lonely Place by New Order, where it just sort of goes into this spacey drone. And, I could probably give a lot more examples, but I was always interested in not making a pop song, but creating songs that basically sounded like the spacey breaks and ends and intros to songs, like the intro to India by Psychedelic Furs also. That's what I was interested in. So I remember very early on being on the bands, and a ambulance would go by and a dog would start barking and someone in the band would say, "Hey, there's Mike's new solo song." Or if I brought something in that nobody really particularly liked, it's like, "Oh, that's perfect for your solo project." Well, eventually the solo project took over and it became Lycia. But John, I started working with John in 1982, and we really connected with this sort of vision that became Lycia. But because I think we both were young and naive at the time, it was easier just to hook on with bands and let other people lead the way, and we would just go along for the ride. It's sort of scary, especially if you're an aloof, shy person like myself, to step out in front and say, "Okay, this is my band, I'm going to take control." I was also really insecure. I wasn't sure if people would really like my ideas, especially consider the fact that a lot of times I'd bring ideas into a band and people would be like, "Oh yeah, it's perfect for your solo project." So you're
right.
So
Mr. Ambient.
I would think probably about in the mid 80s, John and I really started clicking with the style that people now know as that early Lycia style. We were in another band, and it wasn't really until the late 80s where I was feeling a little bit backed up in a corner, because I was in my mid 20s and I sort of felt like I'd been doing music since I was like 18 years old, and I had really nothing to show for it. And that led for us to really push Lycia. But what we did with Wake and those early demos was really just the buildup from what we had been doing going back to 1982. And so a lot of ways I see Wake as like the end of an era. It's an album that's the end. And I think the reason why there's a style change is after, me and John worked on that stuff, and John went off to, he took advantage of a pretty cool opportunity to go on tour with the band Caterwall and be their bass player. He got to go to Japan and travel around. But so that separated him from Lycia, and it was right at the same time when we got the deal for Project Records. So I had to move forward. I didn't want to lose the record deal. I'd been working on music since 1981, and now we're like in 1990, and I finally got the deal, and John's gone. So I moved forward, and I briefly worked with a guy named Will Welsh. We didn't really work on a lot of material, but one thing that did stick from that era was this new approach. It was going to be a new decade. We were going to try some different things. We decided that we were going to be slow, spacey, maybe a bit heavy, but in a spacey way. And that really sort of set the plate for what I eventually did. Will and I set out to do an album that we were going to call Byzantine. It just didn't work out. Will and I were moving in different directions. But I continued that slow motion approach and took it into Ionia, and it was a reinvention. It was just a complete reinvention of the sound, which coalesced with the changing of the decade, and it sort of set the plate for what we did in the 90s, which, a few years later, you were very heavily involved with, and we continued that really up into, I think, Estrella in 1988. I think I look at Ionia to Estrella being an era, and I see what we did in the 80s being an era, and going back to that, Wake was the end of that era. And while it's our only official release from that time, there's a lot of material. And I think if anyone wants to go to our SoundCloud page and listen to those early demos, if you can listen by all the pops and the cracks and the hiss and all that stuff, there's some really powerhouse songs in there that to this day, I just really wish that John and I would have, said, this is a great song. Instead of just recording it as a demo, let's record it rock solid. Because I think it might have really, that could have potentially really caught on. I really believe in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's sad because, you guys had kind of hundreds of songs, right? You had demos and demos and demos.
In terms of finished songs, I think the 100 is definitely an exaggeration, though I think both John and I have used that in the past.
Yeah.
We had hundreds of ideas, but in terms of finished songs, there's probably maybe 30 or so songs, but you have to take into account that's from the fall of 88 up until maybe this very early spring of 1990. So it's just like a year and a half maybe.
Wow.
And we just at that time, all I cared about was just pushing the band. And so I worked a job at the time at the airport. I worked outside, and I get home from work, even in the summer heat here in Arizona. And almost every single night, John would come over to my apartment and we'd work on music. And we just nonstop worked on music. I didn't care about sleep. I'd stay up all night. We would work on music, drink lots of beer, do other things that I don't really, things that would also affect our mental state. And then when that was done,
it helped you stay awake.
It would very much help me stay awake. And after that was done, I'd go back to my tiny little studio apartment, and I would mix music until I realized if I didn't lay down, I would go to work with no sleep. And then I'd go work the whole day and then do the same thing the next day. over and over and over and over again. And, you know, I just threw myself into music at that time. And I think that's one of the reasons I listened to those old demos. They were just the soundtrack to my existence then. And we were such oddballs in Tempe at the time. It was peculiar. For anyone that is from Arizona from that time frame and that lived in Tempe remembers that this was the birth time of jangle rock in Tempe, Arizona. And, you know, a number of bands went on to fame and glory, the biggest band being the Gin Blossoms. Well, these were people that were in our circle. Mm-hmm. We knew these people. They were around. We had mutual friends. They were going in that direction. John and I were going in a very different direction, and we were the odd people out. I remember I used to tell people that not even our friends liked what we were doing then.
Right.
We were two people that were completely separated from everybody else. Will Welsh was on the fringe of the band, and he didn't even like what we were doing. Nobody liked what we were doing, except for us.
Yeah.
And I couldn't understand it because I thought I spent a good portion of the 80s just imitating my favorite bands. And now we found this sound and we started imitating ourselves, and it fed on itself and it fed on itself. And then suddenly I thought, this is it. This is a unique sound. Nobody sounds like this anyplace. And I just thought it was worthy. And we would play these tapes. We were constantly recording, constantly making tapes, and we'd be going ready to go out, go to a house party somewhere, and all riding in the car. And either John or I would say, listen to this new song. We'd put it in the tape player, and it would literally play like 10 seconds, and then everyone would start talking. It's like they didn't care at all. In fact, probably most of those people can't even remember Lycia. They don't know who Lycia is. They all just went on their way, and we went on our way, a very different direction. And so it was tough then, but we felt strongly about what we were doing, and we moved forward with it. And I still remember that time is one of Lycia's best times.
And it's funny because it's mostly undocumented.
It is. It is. I mean, we functioned together in various bands going back to the early 80s, and I can't even find any pictures.
Right.
I mean, to explain the uphill battle that we had in the 80s was, and I use this as a perfect example, we were always the first band to play on a Tuesday night.
Yeah.
We never really had any kind of spotlight shows. And with the exception of maybe a band that John and we were in like 86, 87, we hooked up with the band Caterwaul, a local band here that went on eventually to sign with IRS Records. And they were like really an excellent band at the time. And they stumbled upon one of our shows, and they sort of took us under their wings. And so we got to play some good shows with them. With the exception of that, we never really got any kind of decent shows at all. And no one paid any attention to us at all.
So it's weird because I know I didn't live here, obviously, but I know from talking to you and stuff, there were good bands here. So
there were some good bands.
So why was it like an intimidation thing, or like why didn't you guys try to like not get in for any purpose, but just link yourself into that scene?
Well, I actually have a real good answer for it. It's because we were naive suburban kids. And when I first started out, one of the first people to call an ad I placed in the local New Times, it's a weekly newspaper where all the musicians used to put ads in to form bands. One of the first people to ever call me was a guy named David Wiley. He's sort of a local legend. He passed in the 80s. He died, unfortunately. But he's sort of a local legend, not only here in Phoenix, but in LA. He was in a local punk band. I believe their names were the Consumers. I hope I remember right. But he also went to LA and ended up being on the fringe of I think he was in the band called Human Hands. And it had I think people that went on later to be in maybe Wall of Voodoo and Dream Syndicate.
Oh,
But he was one of the first people to call me about my ad, because I put an ad in, you know, looking for musicians into post-punk music like Killing Joke and that kind of stuff. And he called me, and I was very intimidated. These people that were into the sort of the art punk in Phoenix, they were scary to me.
yeah.
And John and I would occasionally be audition people like this, and we were in awe of them as artists and stuff, but we were really also very sort of scared because they were, you know, very into really unusual things.
Yeah.
And and a lot of those people lived in Phoenix. So we were Tempe suburban kids, and the Tempe scene was more, I guess, new wave oriented and thus more safe.
Mm.
And so we felt more comfortable staying in Tempe in this safe. I mean, we were naive kids. And so you go into Phoenix to some of these clubs and it seemed like anarchy. We used to go down to this hardcore punk club called Mad Gardens. It was a punk place, and they held it in a place that had wrestling during the days they didn't do shows. And so there were fences and there was a spring-loaded stage. And the place would sometimes be very out of control and violent, you know, and I'd be sitting up in the back bleachers there, sort of fascinated by the different bands. I saw Flipper there. I saw Africa Core. I saw Meat Puppets in their early days. I don't know who else I saw there, but you sit up in the bleachers. But you know, when some of the hardcore punk bands were playing, the down on the floor in front of the stage, it was downright violent,
Well, I
and it was sort
remember
of
you telling
scary.
me about that show with some people like nailing live rats or something.
Well, I fortunately was not at any of those shows, but there was a local band called the Feeders, and Frank Discussion was the lead singer, and he was a scary dude. And he did that.
Ugh.
And there were a lot of other stories that I don't feel comfortable saying because it's hearsay.
Right.
You know the one I'm talking about a
Yeah.
famous band,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but I don't feel comfortable talking about it. But that goes back to the fact that I don't know how much of that whole thing with the Phoenix sort of art punk scene was legitimately scary and weird. But I mean, that Frank Discussion thing
Right.
speaks volumes.
Right.
But I mean, being a naive kid from Tempe, that was scary. But you're right. I mean,
Mouse, country mouse.
what's that?
City mouse, country mouse.
Yeah, exactly. But
Yeah.
one of the bands from that era had a big influence on me, and it was a band called Maybe Mental. Dave Oliphant, who I think you're friends with,
Yeah.
he also went on to have Life Garden, which is a band that I really dig a lot. And one of my early bands actually played with Maybe Mental, and I was very impressed with their approach. He was playing keyboards. There was a female singer, and he had Doug Clark of Mighty Sphincter playing guitar for them, and he was playing with distortion, delay, and it was very much a similar Lycia approach there. And I remember looking at that thinking, this is amazing. This is really
Yeah.
amazing stuff. But I think if John and I would have gravitated in that direction, we would have fit really well in that underground scene from Phoenix. But
It's
you know,
intimidating.
it was very intimidating for us, and it was easier just to stay in Tempe and be in our bands out there and play in the clubs in Tempe. And you know,
It's kind of a shame though, you know?
it just is what it is.
Yeah.
You know, you could
Because
go
I
back.
think it would have been really cool if you know, somehow you guys would have gotten in on that and then played shows with those guys, because it would have been more you know what I mean? Like, who knows what would have happened?
They definitely artistically were more kindred spirits to me at the time. I know that in the 80s, in the different bands I played in, I always felt as if I needed to be more underground because I felt that the different bands I played in were catering too much to being new wave or like trying to emulate to be MTV bands. And it was always important to me to be more experimental, going
Right.
back to me wanting to be in a band that sounded like intros and breaks.
Right.
So yeah, it later on, just before Lycia, John and I was in a band called Laura's Toy. And we actually did at that point, we were a band that sort of fit everywhere. We would play at sort of these band teen showcases at teen clubs with more commercial sounding bands. The next week we'd go down and play. We played this place called AAA Gardeners Club, which is right down in a real rough neighborhood. Real interesting story because the guy that ran it, his name was Fonzie. He was an African American guy who was known previously as this guy that used to skate around Tempe in the early '80s holding his skull.
That's
And
fun.
he was an artist, and he moved to down to I think it was 7th Avenue and Buckeye. So for those of you in the Phoenix area, you know that's a rough neighborhood. And he had the AAA's Gardeners Club there, and he would put punk and experimental music shows on there. The rest of the nights, it became sort of a neighborhood hangout for people that lived there that would just bring their own beer and hang out, bring their lawn chairs. So it was real common when we would play there, we'd look out and we'd see punks and we'd see goths and we'd see all these underground art people. And then we'd also see all the neighborhood elderly African-American ladies with their 6-pack of beer and their folding chairs. And they would just be sitting there enjoying the night. It was very encouraging to me. I loved being in an environment that had just so much going on.
Yeah.
And I remember in Laura's Toy, we played a show there. They called us the last second to come down and be a part of this bill. It was a sort of a hardcore punk extravaganza. They wanted us to come down and play. Now, we weren't hardcore punk. We had a drum machine, and it sort of had the Lycia guitar bass sound. And we had a different singer at the time, a guy named Brian Wright. And so we loaded up the car. They called us. It was nighttime. They called us. So we drove down there. The event was going on. The band playing before us was playing, and there was absolute mayhem on the floor, people beating the shit out of each other. We were a little bit nervous, but we went on. And then we went on the stage and we played, and all those punks continued to slam dance, but in slow motion.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful evening. They just accepted us. And, taking that into account, we probably would have done well in the underground scene because it was very open, and they accepted that band. And that band was a little more commercial. I think Lycia probably would have really done well in that environment.
So that's interesting because I think music is more like that maybe now again, where different scenes kind of coalesce together, because you'll have like metal bands playing with like dark wave bands and whatever. And it's interesting because that wasn't always the case there in the middle. Like when we were touring, it was very much like you had to look a certain way, you had to have the costume on, you had to play the game, and obviously we didn't fit into that mold. So it was always kind of this setup for disappointment. Like you're put on this bill as a goth band, and people expect you to look a certain way, and the opening bands look a certain way, and the music they're playing is a certain way, and the decorations in the club is a certain way. And then we come on and we're just kind of like whatever. And it was a negative experience because I mean, I will say, like, most people are cool, but there was enough negativity about it that towards the end of it, we were just like, F these people. We want nothing to do with this goth scene. I'm not a goth. I don't want to be a goth. Don't call me a goth. And then something sort of happened where it evolved. to where, and I really feel like it's kind of the infusion of the metal people, where suddenly metal bands are playing spacey guitars and slow motion and this and that, and to where now I think it's like you might have a bill with like a metal, like a legit metal band and a dark wave band and like an electronic band. And it seems like people are back to being sort of like anything underground is fine on the same bill, which is really how it should be.
It is. And, you know, going back to the early 80s, that's the way it was then in the post-punk scene all over. But just from my experience here in Tempe, my first bands would play shows with rockabilly bands,
right,
with reggae bands. And if you go back to post-punk music, you know, I'm an old guy. I was around when post-punk came about. And so I remember those days very clearly. I've been a fan since like 78 of this kind of music. You know, reggae, rockabilly, you know, disco even. They all crept their way into post-punk music. And all of it did. And if you listen to like for instance on our EP Fifth Son, I took great pride on that EP for my bass playing of all things, because I purposely was trying to play the bass more authentically post-punk. So I sort of had some reggae influences on the bass playing. You don't notice it because it's a mesh of styles. But yeah, you're right, because the early 80s, it was open like that. And even through the 80s, it was that way. But in the early 90s, people became more specific. And I think a lot of people felt negative towards me about me fighting the goth tag. But I mean, I'll be perfectly honest with you. We were a post-punk band throughout the 80s. And I wasn't even familiar with the goth tag.
Right.
When Ionia came out and people were calling it goth, I didn't even really know what that meant.
Right.
I didn't really absorb the full meaning of it until we went on the Stark Corner tour and we played our first live in front of people show on that tour. We played it in Berkeley at a club called House of Usher. And it blew my mind.
Yeah.
Because it was a strange foreign world to me. I was fascinated by it because the music they were playing was varied and very good.
Right.
But it wasn't what I was. I can understand why, maybe because of the moody aspect of Lycia, why goths would like it, but we're no more goth than Swans are goth. We're no more goth than Killing Joke or Wire.
Right.
Those are the bands that I saw as my heroes.
Right.
But for whatever reason, there was this perception that we were goth, and it was frustrating in the 90s not because we would show up someplace and we were called goth. It was frustrating when you go someplace and when someone would look at you and realize you weren't goth, you could see the look on their face of disappointment. And I have a perfect story of that. And I think you probably know where this is.
Yeah, I know which one you're going to tell.
Stark Corner tour. We were in the Bay Area for several days. We did a show down at Stanford, and which went really well. It was live on the air and in the studio. And then we played at House of Usher in Berkeley. I can't remember the timeline when it was, but we also did it in-store at a big record store up there. I can't remember what it, maybe Amoeba.
Was it Vinyl Fetish or something?
No, we did that later in Hollywood. Okay. This was up in Berkeley. And we did this in-store, this really big record store in Berkeley. And Dave Gallis he was in the band and he was on tour. So they took us for sort of a meet and greet. And my memory is fuzzy, but I knew it was sort of upstairs, and it almost felt like there were stairs up to this like elevated cage. I can't remember, but we were sitting up there and there were these two guys that were Lycia fans. One was they were two brothers and they came down from Seattle. You knew who I'm talking. I'm not going to say their name because they eventually really trash talk Lycia a couple years later. So I don't even think that it's worthy to even mention their names because
Correct.
They unfairly trash talked us to a lot of people and really tried to make it seem like we were sellouts with the Burning Circle, but that's a different story altogether.
Yeah.
But they were up there. One of the brothers was very goth. The other brother was probably more like what I was. He had a beard and he's wearing flares. And but we were sitting up there, and so these people were coming up to ask, for us to sign their CDs or just to talk to us. And this young woman comes up, very goth, very meek, and she has these antique Arizona postcards that she wants to give to Mike VanPortfleet of Lycia. And she gets to the top of the stairs and she immediately proceeds to go to the very goth looking guy, hands it to it and says, I really love your music.
Didn't she bring you flowers or something too?
I can't remember, but I do remember the postcards.
Yeah.
So the guy says, I'm not Mike from Lycia, he is. Well, at the time, I was sort of in this stark corner persona, which is, I don't want to go too far into this story, but I sort of had this vision of this central character to A Day in the Stark Corner, who was this solitary figure that found himself lost in the desert, and he just was working at some abandoned filling station. He sort of had, that greaseback 50s hair, James Dean looking, and he's just out there
Luke
and he's
Perry.
in a, what's that?
Luke Perry.
Well, sort of like Luke Perry, I guess. Yeah. The joke behind that is people used to tell me I look like him. So, because we even have a similar scar in our eyebrow. But anyways, I didn't have a look that would be like a goth. I look probably like I should be in Reverend Horton Heat or something.
Right.
And this guy said, that's Mike of Lycia. So she turned around and handed me the postcards. And I said, thank you. She said nothing at all to me and turned around and walk away. So I'm like, oh, okay, whatever. So I felt sort of touched that someone would bring me a gift like that. So when the tour was over, I wrote her a thank you note, never heard from her again. My guess is that once she saw that I wasn't,
Gothed out,
goth, and I was just looking like some other like rockabilly dude or something, she was totally turned off and she probably never listened to Lycia again. That right there is why I got so frustrated with Goth Tag, because you remember this later in the decade where someone says, I don't like goth music, so I never listened to Lycia, but I finally listened to it and I love it.
yeah.
And I think to myself,
I've been told
labels,
that so many times.
and that's why I don't like labels. I don't like labels because it gives a preconceived notion of what you are. And while that might make the people feel good that are in the scene, like this is my band, they represent me, you can still like the music. How many people into goth like Radiohead?
Yeah. Or whoever.
Radiohead is Radiohead. They're a band that's just what they are. But for some reason, Lycia could never escape that classification. And when we tried to, we never badmouth. Well, maybe occasionally we did, out of frustration. But for the most,
real frustrated at one point.
Yeah, but I think mostly we were pretty fair about it.
Yeah.
But because we said we weren't goth, people took that instead of us just what it was, like we're not goth. They took it instead as we hate goth.
Right,
which is a big difference.
Yeah,
because I don't hate goth.
Right. My problem in general is being pigeonholed. Like if you want to define yourself as something, that's fine. I don't want to define myself. So I'm not going to say I'm XYZ because to me, there's no point in defining who you are as a human being.
Right.
If anybody else feels the need to identify as X, Y, and Z, good for them, but don't apply your rules to me because I'm not doing that to myself. And I think another thing that was aggravating is with the goth scene, it is a very visual scene. That's the fashion aspect of it is a huge part of that scene, and that's completely fine. Do your thing, whatever. But like when you're playing a show and someone comes up to you and says, Mike was wearing that shirt the last time I saw you guys play. And
yeah,
we've got one bag for 30 days of clothes. What do you think you might see a repeat outfit? We're not Madonna.
Yeah, and hello, Jim Morrison wore the same leather pants probably every performance he ever played. Come on, man, it's about music.
Exactly. So that was aggravating. And I actually was gonna bring up that whole burning circle thing because the evolution of the band, like obviously Ionia was different than Wake. Start Corner, you could feel the continuation from Ionia, but it's also its kind of own thing. It, to me, Start Corner is almost like a classical album. To me, I don't know. And then the Burning Circle is very different. So, but again, to me, it all makes sense. It's kind of like the Cure's history, where every album sounds different, but it makes sense. But I remember, when that album came out, most people were fine with it or whatever. But then there was people like that guy who was telling people, "Oh, Lycia sold out and this and that." And first of all, I'm like, "Where's this money that we must have got for selling out?" Because that never happened.
Yeah.
But just like, I think, like, I know that I got blamed a little bit for it, and I'm sure Dave got blamed a little bit for it,
But
So
in fairness,
aggravating.
but the thing about it is, you're right. You got blamed and Dave got blamed. But disc 1 of Burning Circle is like 95% me. I mean,
Right.
Dave came in and played bass, but I wrote the guitar parts. I programmed the drum parts. I wrote the vocals. I demoed all those songs. Every one of those songs was demoed. Dave came in and just played bass on it. I think what about Lycia is that it's funny because there's this perception that there's this Lycia sound. But what is the definition of Lycia sound? Because we have a song like The Bells on Wake, but then we have The Boiler Room on the Bleak album. Then we have Pray. And then we have El Diablo. Then we got Antarctica.
Right.
I mean, I'm a music fan. I've always been a music fan, and I like a lot of different kinds of music. And that music seeps into what I do. And so it's all over the place. And I think going back to our earlier part of our conversation about the new material work, and it's always important to me to infuse new ideas and just to keep moving. A lot of my heroes did that. David Bowie did it. He was constantly reinventing himself. And with the exception of a brief time in the 80s where he was making pop music, which I wasn't a big fan of, he always delivered. And when I go to write a new song, I never sit there and think I'm going to write this new song to fit to this crowd. I'm writing to an audience of one myself. I just want to write something that resonates with that time and place, and I don't really care really what stylistically it sounds like.
Well, and as a member of the band, I'm aware of that too. Like, I know that, if I want to do something weird, I do something weird someplace else. It's not fitting in the vision that you have. And so I like, I understand that I'm just another instrument in the band. Not that I don't have my say in my parts in that, I write my own lyrics, etc. But I know that there's a certain aesthetic that has to be there. And I also know that it's kind of an instrument, just like you would edit your parts, you edit my parts, and so and everybody in the band, I think, knows that it's a band, but it's also your singular I mean, it's probably a lot, like there's plenty of bands like this where it's a band, but there's a central figure that kind of dictates the mood and vibe of the whole thing.
I see I see myself as sort of the director of Lycia, of dictating where we go with the sound. But I look at it, I don't really care what I have to do to get to the end result. I hear something in my head when a song starts. And, you know, sometimes somebody, as you well know from recent work, a part might get sacrificed. It's nothing personal. It's just that as I'm putting the song together, I hear things a certain way, and sometimes a part needs to be cut, sometimes a part needs to be changed. It all I care is about really is the end result, and that it fits this sort of flow and aesthetic.
But I also know that you get surprised sometimes, because sometimes somebody will do something that you're not expecting, and you might like initially be sort of like, I don't know if that works. And then it does work, because like even stuff on Cold, some of my vocals, you were like, you need to redo that. And me and Dave were like, no, this is how it's supposed to be. And like, you know, things like that. And like, even, you know, stuff that other people bring in is different than maybe what you thought, but then you work in it, like we work within it, and it, you know, I mean, especially the last couple albums, there's things in there that you probably going into it wouldn't have been like, let's do a song like that.
Yeah.
And then John brings something in, or Dave brings something in, and it becomes completely different.
Yeah, I like to give people their freedom, but in the end, I like to have control over the final presentation of it, because I have a vision of the song that's probably different than what everyone else has, because I'm looking at the song as a finished entity, but an album as a finished entity too. Like just earlier today, we were sitting in our living room, and I'm telling you the first 3 songs on the EP and playing you these demos and saying, this is what I visualize.
Yeah.
I nonstop think about this stuff. It's been
even like the Gary Newman cover, you had no plans of that.
Zero plans.
John's like, hey, listen to this. And you're like, that would be fun, you know, whatever. And I think John surprises you probably more than me or Dave at this point, because
I don't follow you on that.
Huh?
I don't follow you on that. Well, how do you mean that?
Well, because I think that there's a general formula for Lycia for the past decade, and you haven't worked really with John for that whole time. And so now he's bringing these songs in that are different than that, but familiar to you because that's what you guys did 30 years ago or whatever. So
yes and no.
So it's like surprising, but not surprising, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's yes and no, because John and I in the 80s primarily functioned in a guitar bass collaboration type situation. And before that, he was a drummer.
Yeah.
And we only worked on a handful of synth songs. But we did work on synth songs on and off. But his writing style is similar, whether it's on synth or bass. And 30, what is it, 30 going on 30 plus years or whatever, 40 years.
Crazy. I can't.
I'm familiar with it, even though we haven't worked a lot together. I mean, we worked together in the 80s and then briefly in the mid 90s with the Dust Side project that never really was realized. And then Empty Space, which was, that Empty Space was just a weird thing altogether. But
maybe it's more surprising to me than it is to you.
Yeah. But when he sent me the synth pieces that ended up on In Flickers, when I first heard them, I was like, I don't know how I could fit this into Lycia.
Right.
Initially, it was going to be me adding stuff to something that he was working on. But, once I started working on it, it was just like, this reminds me of 1989. In fact, I think I remember saying it's the spirit of 88, 89 recapture.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that that ended up happening because I think it adds such a cool dynamic, you know,
Yeah.
and I think it really resonates with a lot of the younger people now and some of the older people who are like, oh my God, that reminds me of being in the club, you know, in 1987 or something.
I tell you that the Song of Failure has, I'm still shocked to this day that I get, like any musicians out there, you probably get that weekly report from your digital distributor on what songs are doing well. Since In Flickers came out in late 2018, every week that report comes, and every week a Failure is by far the biggest song. I mean, it just,
So interesting.
every week it just has tons of plays, and um it's interesting. I mean,
It
we
is.
have such a long history and so many different songs, and that song has just clicked on with people.
Yeah.
And
It's
um
interesting because I would really love to know how.
well, first and foremost, it's a good song. I mean,
Well, I
I
mean,
can I
yeah.
can say that because, I mean, I think what really makes it great is this just driving synth and drums that John brought in, and it really brought out a completely different element in my guitar playing. And I think the other element that really works immensely well on it, and it's something that we talk about maybe exploring more, is doing those dual lead vocals where we sing sort of monotone
Yeah.
together. I think it worked really good on End Day Again from Fifth Son. And I think A Failure sort of taps into that same vibe. It's I really want to do more stuff like that because as a music fan myself, I really dig that. I think that sounds really
Yeah.
cool.
But I'm just my point was like how like where did that get connected that you know maybe some of the other songs didn't that it made it leap up so much higher than the others, you know what I
I
mean?
don't I don't know, because I think the other collaboration we did with John, the song Mist, is a rock solid song. But you look at the collaborations we did with Dave on that album, I absolutely love Rewrite.
Yeah.
That song is I don't know where that song came from, but in terms of how in the end how it came together, but it feels like magic to me. And you know, I love everything about In Flickers. Like I said, I think that's Lycia's best album. That's, of all the things I've ever done in my life as a musician, that's the album I'm most proud of.
Yeah.
And I absolutely love the last song on that album, Autumn into Winter. It's a cold outtake that Dave never ever shared with me back when we were working on Cold,
Yeah.
because it was a, as you well remember,
Because
it
we
was
hated
very
each other.
it was a difficult situation. You know, grown up
Yeah.
adults shouldn't live in the same house, and it was just especially when you're creative, there was a lot of
And moody.
price. Um, but that song, he had told me that, he goes, yeah, I sent this cold outtake to Tara like a while ago, because I was asked when we were working on Flickers, I was like, do you have anything that's like maybe has the vibe of like what we did in the Cold era? And he's like, well, I sent this cold outtake to Tara like a year ago. Did she play it for you? I'm like, I can't remember it. So he sent it to me
Yeah,
and
I
I
don't
heard it.
remember.
And I was like, this song is like completely amazing. And then when I started working on it, it just clicked. And that song means so much to me, because not only because me, you, and Dave got to revisit the Cold era on that, but lyrically, that song means a lot to me. You know, I actually called out things from my childhood in there.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the work I've done since Quiet Moments, it really is, you know, lyrically, I a lot of times drift towards that feeling of feeling disconnected and lost from the innocence of my childhood home. And So Autumn into Winter really, for me, it's a song that can only resonate with me and me only in the way that it does, based on the lyrics and the music. And so there's really no reason for me to sit there and try to explain it to anybody. But for me, on a personal level, that connects with my memories of my childhood like rock solid. And I love that song. Every time I listen to that song, I'm just lost into those thoughts of me being the age of our son right now, standing in my yard as a kid and just looking around and seeing everything and just missing that time. Like,
Yeah.
mainly, you know.
Yeah. I was talking about this with a couple different people because most people, well, I won't say most people, a lot of people get weirdly sad at this time of the year.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that, and I think a lot of it is that you remember being a little kid and how magical Christmas is, and you watch Rudolph, and and you're in it.
Mm-hmm.
Like reindeers talk, snowmen, sing songs, and like the snow is perfect, and the trees and everything. And then as an adult, you're like so far removed from that kind of magic
Yeah,
that is sad. And
it is.
it's kind of like how you're describing the feeling of that song, is that you're just so far removed from that simple, clean, innocent, unjaded person that it's sad,
It is. Well, I think you nailed it right there in that. And it goes back to our early discussion about us feeling alienated by being classified
Right.
as a certain genre. And you remember well when we toured in the 90s and my nonstop frustration of going from club to club and feeling misrepresented, because what music has always been for me, always, from the time I picked up my first guitar in the late 70s and wanted to do music, it never was about fitting into a scene or about partying or about any of that stuff. It was always about me finding an outlet for the very feelings I just explained to you,
Right.
which are solitary, isolated, personal times. Music has always been that about that for me. And so when we're out touring and people are trying to define our music as being a soundtrack to a particular genre and lifestyle, it alienated me because I'm like, no, this is about me being a kid standing in a field and just feeling the essence of time and place, or walking along the canal in the late 70s in Tempe in the middle of the night, seeing the monsoon storms off in the distance. My music to me has always been solitary. It's never been about being in a club. In fact,
And
a
then
lot of times,
you're on a stage with like a blow up coffin
mhm,
and spider webs and stuff, and it's like you're expected to make that fit that, and it
yeah,
just
I
doesn't
mean,
work, and then you're judged because it doesn't work.
we're on stage, and that picture that's the cover of Quiet Moments of me being a 4-year-old kid standing in the
Blizzard.
in a blizzard, which is I mean, as you well know from my life, that represents a lot, being a little kid isolated like that.
Yeah.
It was the catalyst for so much in my life. And here I'm making music about that. And people want it to be about music to dance to or make love to or whatever. It alienates me because this is personal, deep
Right.
stuff. I consider myself more closely related to Franz Kafka than any
Right.
goth band. You know, I, there's been people out there that have compared what I've done to either um, something like existential literature or mysticism. And I've told you this a lot. My entire life has been a tug of war between existentialism and mysticism.
Right.
Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's what the music's about. It's not about anything besides that, and it's solitary. I've
Right.
used the reason that I've involved you, Dave, John, and for a brief time Will, is that I felt that I found kindred spirits that can add to this vision that I have. And that's why I avoid collaborations a lot of times. Why I keep to myself. It's personal music.
Yeah.
And I've never ever have done anything in music ever because music is fun.
Right. Because really
Never.
it's not. It's really not.
It's hard. Music is hard.
Yeah.
It's always about the release. It's always about, you know, these hidden feelings and letting them out and immersing yourself into time and place. And when I'm around people that just talk about music,
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
exactly, I find myself almost getting pissed off
Yeah.
because I'm just like, you don't understand what it is that I'm trying to do, and probably a lot of the bands that you like are trying to do. You've missed the point.
Right.
Because I mean, Robert Smith writes pop songs, but I think Robert Smith would 100% understand what I'm saying right
I'm sure. No doubt
now,
about it.
because it's the same thing.
Right.
But as you all know, we've met a lot of people over the years, and to them, music is about fun.
It's a
It's
pose.
about fun.
It's a costume. There's no like realness to it. It's like, we talk about this sometimes, how we'll see certain people on like Instagram, and every single picture they post, they're posed, everything's cool, they've got to have a certain aesthetic. They never post a picture of them sitting on the couch in jeans and a t-shirt. Now, you know that person doesn't go through life sucking in their cheeks and, you know, doing these whatever things they're posting about. And so it's such a phony crock of shit that it's off-putting to me, you know? And I think that there's so many bands that relate to what we're saying now, more so. I mean, maybe not, but you know, when you find your people that it is about the music and they don't care if they're not in a costume, and they'll go on stage in a hoodie and a pair of ripped up jeans, and they don't have to have like this persona.
Yeah.
And I back to what you were talking about earlier, when, you know, people, when that girl showed up and she thought you were the uber goth guy. To me, I was actually, because I didn't know what you looked like at all when I wrote to you. I had no idea. And to me, whenever we finally got around to like really talking to each other and you sent me pictures, I was just like, oh my God, this music comes out of this normal looking person that I could see working at the Clark station. And it was kind of the same thing. Like, I find that more intriguing, that, you know, like a band like Swans, like all of that music comes out of people that you could see at the grocery store. Yeah. And they don't have to have a costume, and they don't have to have this fake persona. To me, that's more interesting than some contrived bullshit.
It's just sad to me that we even have to have this conversation. It's a conversation that should never, ever be discussed. You know, if you have to justify the way you look, then maybe you just need to move on.
Well,
but I mean,
really, what's the point of that?
But I've always been a come one, come all.
100%.
You know, I don't want to be like, we're doing this for anybody. We're just making music for ourselves, and I'm thrilled that anybody likes it.
100%.
Just don't put your expectations on yourself onto me.
And that was another thing I wanted to talk about, like that I came to mind back when we were talking about the early days of Lycia and how you would play shows and there'd be like reggae bands and punk bands and all this stuff. Your circle of friends would be like that too back then.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
it was.
You would have metal friends, you'd have stoner friends, you'd have skaters, you'd have kids that were into rap, just like all the kind of disenfranchised people that didn't really fit into the mainstream. We all hung out together, and we all, you know, because you're all together, you're all sort of listening to everybody's kind of music, and it was just all considered alternative, you know.
Well, when I first met Will Welsh, he didn't fit anything that would normally say he's the guy for the band. John had, this was prior to us using the Lycia name. And John and I were in a band. John left, he moved out of state. And me and the singer of that band were looking for a replacement. And we stumbled upon Will Welsh. Now, understand at the time, this was the late, maybe 87. And so this was the time of Gene Loves Jezebel and the Cult and bands like that were popular. And the singer in the band that I was playing in really wanted to emulate that kind of vibe. And I was still, into the whole Cocteau Twins meets, Dead Can Dance meets on the harder end, maybe Cindy Talk and Big Black. That's what I was trying to emulate. And we met this guy at a party. This guy was a guy that was into death metal and hardcore rap. But we discovered that we had a mutual love of Killing Joke. Well, that was Will Welsh.
Yeah.
And after talking to him for a couple hours, I realized this was a guy that, even though he had a completely different musical background, that I felt I could work with. And we started working together. And within a couple of weeks, we wrote some really, really powerful songs that I wish I had on tape someplace because they were really good. It was about just, and I think him coming in with these different influences actually spurred me on. And I think fast forward in the future, you were talking about the current scene being a little bit more receptive. I think it is. I think it's gotten a little stale the last year or so.
Yeah.
And it's become, I think it's, I see a lot of comparisons to how the 90s dark wave scene went about being about good music to eventually just dance music and costumes.
Yeah.
And I think the current scene is doing that quite a bit too. And there's certain bands out there that put out some really good albums, and now they're just mailing in, much like a lot of the bands in the 90s did. But I think there was a time maybe, I don't know, 5-6 years ago where things were just, it was coalescing just perfectly, where you had all these different genres that were just merging together, and everybody was just being what they were, and it was really healthy. And it was, I look at a band like a label like Handmade Birds, and Rich that runs that label, I can personally just thank him for Lycia's Second Life, because I was dead in the water. And just coming back and doing the Cold vinyl and then Quiet Moments with him, and seeing the wide variety of stuff that he had on his label, things that you wouldn't think would be together, it really fit my aesthetic.
Yeah.
It really spurred me on, and it really made me feel excited about doing music again. And I just hope that the new scene can continue to be as varied as it is. And going back also to what you were saying earlier, really, the metal scene is really super responsible for bringing a lot of life into dark music and atmospheric music again.
Yeah.
Atmospheric, I don't want to name any bands, but I mean, you look at the 90s, and you had all these cool shoegaze bands, and they all eventually became somewhat, not all, but a lot of them became pompous, and we're better than you, and you're not in the club, and we only like this and this. And there was always a sense of exclusion. And Lycia, you know, there was a shoegaze scene here in Arizona, and we were accepted for a while, and then we were sort of, no, you guys go over here. You're not fitting into our nice little scene. It, you know, it was a little alienating to me, and it was disappointing. It made me sad, actually.
Yeah.
That never happened with the metal scene. Never.
No.
The metal scene has been so good to Lycia.
Yep.
Which is ironic considering the fact that, you know, in the 70s, when I was a pretty wide ranging fan of music, I would listen to Sex Pistols and I would listen to Judas Priest.
Right.
You know, I'd listen to Joy Division, and, you know, I'd listen to Yes. I was all over the place. But metal had no influence on me anything more than I liked distortion.
Right.
And that was probably more a reflection of my love of 60s music and the fuzz box.
Right.
But I never liked metal. I never followed metal.
Right.
And in the 90s, when I was hearing that metal bands were getting into Lycia, it was like that robot that head explodes in a cartoon. Does not compute. It didn't make any sense to me. I couldn't see how it made any sense. It makes sense to me now.
Right.
But I never could have pictured a time where metal would have been the saving grace of dark music, and it has been.
100%. Yeah.
You know, you listen.
People making the best music out there are metal people.
You're right. Or people that had one time been metal and have moved on to new territory. But you're right. The thing I like about the metal people is, going back to something I said earlier, come one, come all. A lot of them are that way.
Yeah.
They really are. They're not judgmental. They're not. They're just into music.
Yeah.
And I think the first time I really witnessed that was, I think in '95, when we were on the Burning Circle tour. We were in Minneapolis, and we finished the show, and this guy comes up to me, and he's like, you know, I was a metal guitar player, and I lived and died super fast metal, but then I got carpal tunnel and I couldn't play anymore, and I was so depressed. And then I heard you guys. Now I reinvented my guitar sound, and I'm playing minimalism, and I love it.
Yeah.
I think in '97 we played a show in Austin, Texas, and there were all these metal people standing in front of the stage that had come up from Mexico.
Yeah.
And likewise, and of course, you know, all the good things that Typo Negative did for us.
Right.
In the mid 90s. I mean, as you well know, and likewise, I'm not going to name any names here, but there are bands from the 90s, big bands, very, very famous bands that potentially could be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, that borrowed very liberally from us, that were at our shows. We saw them there. We had mutual friends. We knew things. They've never claimed us as an influence, and yet you can hear it all in their music.
Yeah.
And they never, ever would ever admit that we had any kind of influence on them. And if they would have, it could have made a difference for us.
Right.
It could have maybe spread the word about us, but this one particular individual was so effing selfish about thinking that he's the coolest guy in the world. He basically stole from us and then took credit for it himself.
Yeah.
And he's still doing it to this day to other bands.
Yeah.
Who hopefully will wake up and realize that they're also being used.
Yeah.
Typo Negative never did that.
Nope. Peter
spread the word. He even offered to make us sandwiches when we toured with him. Every guy in that band, top notch, good guy. And they treated us so good on a tour that was difficult for us. I mean, bands now will go out and tour with a metal band, like atmospheric bands, and it's accepted. But in 1995, we were on the bill. I mean, think about this. Lycia was on a bill with Typo Negative, the Misfits, Electric Hellfire Club, and Lycia. You might as well just put the name on it. It should have been Typo Negative, Misfits, Electric Hellfire Club, and Target. Because that's what we were.
Yeah.
And
Target practice.
Target practice. I mean, you wouldn't think playing in an atmospheric band that you would be spit on at a show. That you would have to stand in front of your rack saying, I'd rather have this beer bottle hit me in the crotch than destroy my lexicon.
Yeah.
And having a sound guy tell you, I've never seen a band get such bad abuse. But we sat out there night in and night out and took it.
It was hard.
And guess what happened? It spread the word.
Yeah.
Shortly thereafter, there were articles in Metal Edge magazine about
I remember Rip. Was there like a Rip magazine?
I think so.
Yeah, I think we saw it at like the gas station at on Sea Route 14. We went in there one time. It was like Rip.
Yeah. It just goes to show you, you know, what's going on now in this cross-pollination between all these bands. We were there right at the beginning, and you know, you can really thank one person for this, and it's Peter Steele. Yeah. Maybe Justin Broderick too, because you know, that Pantera, Typo Negative, Godflesh tour, from what I've heard is that Lycia was a regular thing that they listened to on that tour. Yeah. Sort of mind-blowing. You know, these big rock stars out on tour, and we're like taking breaks in our tour, working in a factory. And
I know.
But I mean, it just goes to show you that, you know, a lot of those people that were threatening to kill us eventually came back and bought our albums and are now maybe some of our bigger fans.
Yeah, I feel like a huge chunk of the people that support us now are a direct result of Peter's publicity for us. I think he did probably as much as the record labels and
he stuff. Really did. And what I dug about all of that was it was real. It wasn't like the other individual that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Who was he's just a self-serving dude. Yeah. Peter was not self-serving. Peter just was a guy that liked music, and he was a good guy. Just was a good guy, and he helped us out, and you know, every guy in that band is good, and their crew was good to us, and their sound guy was good to us, and you know, we might have been getting treated bad by the fans, but everyone behind the scene was totally cool to us. You know, Electric Hellfire people guys they were all super awesome, and we didn't really deal a lot with anyone in the Misfits, but I'll tell you what, there are people in their fan clubs at that first show. The first, as you remember, that first show was supposed to be at Roseland Ballroom, but the night before in Poughkeepsie, they did a practice show. They invited their fan clubs down there, and you know, after we got done playing, we went up and sat in the balcony because we wanted to watch. I mean, it was the Misfits coming back. We wanted to watch that, and we were sitting up there with all their hardcore fans, and they were over there talking to us, and they were very cool to us, and it was a very bizarre world for us at the time because we were definitely stepping outside of our comfort zone.
It was definitely shell shock, because to go from playing shows where people pretty much know what to expect from you, and then you go and nobody's ever heard of you on these bills, and you know, we had certainly never been spat on before.
No.
Maybe given a couple dirty looks, but nobody ever threw a glass bottle at my head before.
Well, considering the fact that I told you that my earlier bands that were sort of Lycia-esque were playing in hardcore punk venues and people were slam dancing in slow motion, I sort of felt that was not going to happen to me. But you know, I still remember that first show on that tour in New London, Connecticut. We walked out on stage, and you know, the crowd was just chanting all these different Typo Negative things the whole time, and it wasn't rough, it wasn't violent towards us, but it was loud, and you could tell people didn't like us. But the next night in Syracuse was
next level.
It was next level. I mean,
I'd be scared to play there in Syracuse still.
It was unsettling being on stage and seeing about 5 or 6 football player sized security guards standing in front of the stage, literally beating the shit out of people that were trying to climb over them to get on stage to kill us.
I
And
distinctly remember watching security drag one guy to the side of the stage and beat the living hell out of him and threw him out the club. I watched the whole thing from while we were playing.
now my philosophy was, we're here to play. And I remember seeing that poor gal in the front row with the Lycia shirt,
Yep.
this tiny little girl. In all fairness, we should have stopped playing and went over and just talked to her and give her some free merch. But I felt that we were there to play and we were going to play. And if it meant that I was going to need stitches at the end of the day, oh, so be it. I wasn't going to walk off that stage.
Was that just shocked?
I still remember, though, when we got off the stage, Thomas from Electric Hellfire came up to us and he said, I can't remember the exact words, but I think he said something about like he might have to use the mic stand to club a few of these people. He was nervous.
Yeah, right.
It was a rough night. I mean, because if you remember that night, it was just a disaster. Typo Negative had some problems with their van. They were late. Sound check was late. It was cold out. The people were outside. It was raining.
Yeah.
They came in. They were
ready to fight.
They were ready to fight. And then there's me and you on stage with our DAT tape and our atmospheric music. I remember that night we played a short set, but I do remember we played The Morning Breaks So Cold and Gray. And while we were playing it, I could literally hear people during the break saying they wanted to fucking kill me.
I know.
And I'm up there trying to like get myself in the moment and thinking, okay, well, and watching these security. I mean, how surreal was that? The Morning Breaks So Cold and Gray, slow motion on stage, and a bunch of violent skinheads trying to climb over football players to kill us.
And you know, the irony is, I think that was Peter's favorite song. Well, I think I remember him saying that.
How fitting would it have been if we would both been killed playing his favorite song?
Yikes.
Yeah, so
by the end of that tour, we were only playing 4 songs a night. We had shortened our set to, we played 4 songs and got the hell off the stage.
But I have to say, and I truly have to say this, is that if you remember, after Syracuse, we went back to the hotel and we were like, maybe we should bolt this tour.
Yeah.
This might not be the best thing for us. But we decided to hold on and do another show. So the next show, I believe, was in Boston.
Yeah. And thank God we did.
And the Boston crowd showed up.
Yep.
And it went well. And I also have to say, New York City, the best music city in the world.
Yep.
We played that show on Halloween and it could have been a disaster, but those fans there were
great.
They were open to us. We got a good response. We had good sound, and playing at the Roseland Ballroom was really probably the highlight.
Yeah.
Of all our touring, to be able to play in a concert side stage. I mean, Lycia never graduated to anything more than being a small cult band, but to be able to play on a concert side stage and to have immaculate sound. Sam from Project was there running the board for us, and he did a really good job on the sound, and the club was awesome. And
do you remember that they wanted us to stand on their risers, and we were like, no, we'll be a bigger target if we stand on the risers.
But it went well for us, and we actually also got a sneak preview of October Rust songs that night because Peter played them in soundcheck for us. And if I remember right, the songs even sounded a bit more shoegazing. I mean, at that night, to be honest with you, that might have been the night that post-metal was invented. Because they were playing the songs off October Rust, and it sounded like these post-metal bands out there now. It was like this heavy shoegaze, and I remember me, you, and Sam and a few of the stage hands were around in this gigantic room that's the Roseland Ballroom, hearing these songs in sound check, and I was pretty blown away at that. So it was a privilege to see that.
I'm still super sad that you never got to work with Peter. That you guys never got to do your thing.
Yeah, you know, it just wasn't in the cards. I mean, I know he pitched the idea to me, and he had grander ambitions to involve other people that probably would have considered themselves too high and mighty to be involved in something, which is their loss.
100%.
Because it would have been a very interesting thing, but you know, there's a time and place for everything, and it didn't play out. But
yeah, it's sad.
Yeah,
I try to picture what that would have been like. It would have.
It's hard to say.
So, music. You've well documented your music influences. What about things that are not music that influence you as far as vibe, philosophy, aesthetic for your creating stuff?
Well, it really all goes back to my childhood, I think. You know, when I was a kid, I was a shy, aloof guy, and I spent a lot of time alone. As you well know, in this household with two talkers, I'm sort of the quiet guy at times. I can lose myself and just sort of drift. I'm very comfortable being lost in my thoughts. And as a kid, you know, I would drift off into sort of these just distant spaces. I don't know how to explain it. And I think I've spent my entire life trying to emulate that. And I think maybe, you know, when you see an atmospheric or a movie, or you read a book that just influences you, that's a darker, you know, like something like Fahrenheit 451 or something, where you can just really immerse yourself into this sort of escapist, be an outsider type of thing. That's always been my influence. You know, I don't know. You go outside, you sort of let you let your over rationalizing thoughts just sort of disappear, and you just absorb the time and place that you're around. It can be powerful. That's pretty much just what I try to do with the music. I'm not going to be one of these people that talk about literature or high art, nothing like that has influenced me, because it really hasn't. It's just about mood. Mood is just everything to me. You know, probably the walks along the canal back in 80 and 81 when I was in high school and just fresh out of high school. My family moved around a lot. By the time I got to my last school, I was pretty much just over trying to, you know, have friends and stuff. And I was pretty much just kept to myself and was interested in music. And so I would do I had a lot of solitary time. And where I lived at the time, I lived on a canal here in Arizona. So there was driving paths up on each side of the canal. So I would wait until the world was asleep, about 11, 12 o'clock. We lived right on the canal, Tempe Canal. So I'd jump the fence, walk up and down the canal. A lot of times, you know, like a lot of young kids, I would be doing things I shouldn't be doing, whether it was drinking or smoking pot or whatever. And I'd just be in my own little world, and just, it was a pure escapist world where I didn't have to worry about school or getting a job or impressing anyone or impressing a girl or anything. It was just me by myself and the night and the stars and the moon, and being in that different state of mind. And, you know, going back to where we started, you know, I think it was probably 81. You know, I'd hear a song. I went and saw this movie called Erga Music War. And it was a movie I really liked a lot because there were a lot of bands in there that I really dug. And there was this segment in it with Gary Newman doing Down in the Park. And to me, in my mind, always associate those late night walks with that song because it's the same type of mood.
Right.
Really airy and late night and escapist and just walking along that canal at night and just dreaming about the future of when I can maybe do music on my own that might emulate that same type of mood. And, I never thought about like, I'm going to be in a band someday and I'm going to have this and it's going to make me money and no, it was always just about, I'm going to do music and these moods are just going to emanate from me and it's just going to be pure. That's all that's all it's about to me. It's all I care about. I mean, as you all know, I'm not a person that really even likes hanging out with people or talking to people or, I'm sort of the anti rock star type of person. I don't like any of that stuff, but I do love creating music that emanates those moods. It's really been my obsession since probably about 1978.
Mm-hmm.
And I started it in 1981. I mean, in all reality, Lycia started in 1981. I just didn't have the guts to really push myself towards it until 88. I just rode along on a couple of singers' ambitions. I mean, Michael Irwin in the early days, this guy was ambitious and he'd get us shows and he would arrange practice spaces and he would get people to come take pictures of us. And I was just the guy that was standing on the side saying, okay, I'm just going to come along for the ride. And then later on, Brian Wright was the same type of guy. He would get shows for us and I would just show up and play. Just show up. We're playing a show tonight. I'd show up, set up my guitar, my effects, play. That's it. But through that whole time, there was Lycia. In fact, I had a lot of names for my side and solo project, and one of them was sort of based on Lycia. Going back to Erga Music War, when Echo and the Bunnymen starts, go look at that club name that's at the very beginning of that clip. And I used to refer to
That's funny.
I used to refer to that music as Lyceum music because you didn't have the internet then. You couldn't research stuff. So I would go up and buy like NME from the bookstore and read about all my favorite bands from England. And I would see that they all were playing at this club called the Lyceum.
Yeah, that's funny.
And so I sort of naively thought, oh, that's a post-punk club. And
that's funny.
All my favorite bands, Killing Joke, Echo and the Bunnymen, Joy Division, The Cure, they all play at this. So that's it. So I used to refer to it as that Lyceum music. And so that years later, when I finally decided to push ahead and I was looking for a name for the band, I'm looking through, and I was really interested in Greek mythology at the time and Roman mythology. And I'm looking through these books, and I'm also a geographer. And that's what I do for a living besides music. Looking at these maps, and I see this ancient map. I think it was a Roman map. And they had a region in Turkey called Lycia, Lycia. So that's sort of funny, considering the fact that that's a variation of a name
Sure.
that I used earlier. So, in the 90s, I used to always say Lycia started in 1988, because to be perfectly frank with you, I was sort of embarrassed the fact that I had spent an entire decade and had nothing to show for it.
Mm.
Who wants to be proud of the fact that they underachieved for a decade because they were too afraid to push their own project forward? It was easier just to ride along on someone else's project. And so, the fact of the matter is I had been doing music for a decade when Ionia came out, and I had nothing to show for it really beforehand, because when Ionia came out, Wake was nothing more than an obscure demo that only about 25 copies had actually gotten out. So it didn't seem like a real release to me. So when people were interviewing me in the early Lycia days, the same insecurity that kept me from pushing Lycia forward in the 80s is the same insecurity that drove me to tell people that I didn't really even start my band seriously until 88. But in reality, I started the band during those canal walks in 1981. I just never had the guts to stand up in the front and say, oh, I'm going to be the leader of this band, and this is the direction we're going to go in. It was easier just to say, I'm young, I can do this in the future, and this will be my side project. But for now, I'll just go play in this band guitar because it was easier. You know how young people are. You do the easier thing. You're not going to.
Well, and plus, it's somebody else's responsibility then, so you don't have to take the blame if it sucks.
Mm-hmm.
You just quit and move on to the next band.
That's a perfect point, because I remember very clearly playing shows in some of my early bands, and one or two of the songs would be totally botched. And everyone at the end of the show would be bummed out, and I'd be like, I'm fine. I did my part good. You know, what's the problem? I got up there. I didn't make a mistake. I'm good.
Yeah.
It's sort of selfish and immature, but that's just the way I was then.
Well, you're a kid too, you know.
But yeah, you know, but so Lycia really, if I have to be purely honest with myself, Lycia really started in 81. Obviously, Ghost Descends, written in 83. The Ruins, From Remnants in the Ruins, written in 83. You know, Remnants from that, 87. Lightroom, 85. A song that we're going to hopefully work on for the EP, a song called Frail, was written in 85.
I love that song, by the way.
You hear some of those other songs that I play around here. There's a lot of songs I wrote back then. I either took them into the band and they became something very different in my early bands as everyone changed their parts around, or there were songs that I just didn't have the confidence. Like The Ruins is a song that I wrote in 83, and I never had any confidence to bring it into any of the bands I was in. I kept it. I'd play it at home incessantly and sing it, but I was embarrassed. I just had no confidence then. And so I didn't want to bring it in any of the bands and say, here's a song that I wrote, because I'm like, oh, look, I was afraid that they would read the lyrics and they would realize what a sad sack I really was at the time, because I didn't want people to know that. Right. You know, I was a distant, lonely dude back then, and I kept to myself, and I didn't want my friends to know that. I felt that would show that I was weak or.
Right.
And so it was just easier just to show up and say, okay, you're going to change my song completely around. All right, I'll just play it, whatever. I'm 19 years old and I have a full future in front of me. It wasn't until the late 80s that I felt a bit of desperation, because the one thing that I told myself when I was in college is that I would give myself until age 25. And if I was age 25 and I hadn't made it in music, I would quit. Well, when you're 19 years old and you're just in someone else's band, you're like, I'm 19. I got 6 years. Well, before you know it, I'm pushing 25. And the last band I was in just fell apart. And me and Will Welsh are sharing an apartment, and he's working on his project. And we're spending more time getting drunk and getting high than actually working on music. And I'm approaching my 25th birthday, and I'm like, well, what do I do? What do I do? And there was a time in early 88 that I quit. I was like, okay, I gave it a shot. It didn't work. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to go to graduate school. So I was heading up to Arizona State University because I lived in Tempe, and I was going to get the application to go to graduate school. And I literally stood in front of the doorways and I didn't open it. And I just couldn't do it. And then I went home and I was like, man, you can't quit music without giving it a real shot. Actually, I had spent a decade being a sidekick.
Right.
And that was the day that I decided to continue. And probably shortly thereafter, I picked the Lycia name. And I started demoing songs by myself. Will fortunately had a little home studio. He had a 4-track. He had drum machine. He had keyboards. He had a bass. He had effects. He had some really beautiful rolling effects that you can hear on the Wake release. He was always off skating with his buddies, skateboarding. I'd get home from work, I had all his music equipment. So I thought, I can't quit music. I got to give it one last shot. And that's why I say often, Wake does feel like the end of the line for me to a degree for that era, because, this was probably 9 months before we worked on Wake, and I'm demoing these songs. I finally have the guts to sing live because I was so petrified to sing, petrified. That's why those early demos sound so rough, is because I'm afraid to even hear my own voice in the room. So I'm like really restrained and I'm holding back. And so I recorded these handful of demos and I sent them out. I sent them to labels. I actually took the initiative. Earlier bands had sent out the demos and never got any decent response. And I sent these really poor recorded demos out. And lo and behold, I got like about 6 good, promising responses. I didn't get a label offer, but I got people saying, I like what you're doing. Send me more, including one label. I won't name that label, but it's a label I really respected a lot at the time. And it's a very respected label. And he was like, I'm not going to sign you, but I like what you're doing. And I'm going to recommend you to this label and this label and this label. And it really lit a fire under me and it threw me into it. And then a couple months later, after not seeing him for maybe a year and a half, John Fair just shows up at my door. I lived in this little studio apartment. I didn't have a phone. I was so aloof. I lived in this studio apartment. I didn't have a phone. I had my blinds closed all the time. I was hiding in this. I'd go to work and hide in my little place. And I had just got my first 4-track. I bought it from Will. He needed some money. I bought it. And I was just in this, I didn't have drum machine. I didn't have anything. So I was just writing these things on guitar. And John just showed up one day with this guy, this singer guy he was working with. He's like, we want you to join the band that we're forming. And I listened to their pitch and I wasn't really into it. I felt that it was going to just go the same route as our earlier bands. And the next day I got up, I drove up to a payphone. I had a motor scooter. I drove up to a payphone and I called John and I was like, okay, I'm not interested in working with that singer, but I'm interested in working with you. And everything just fell into place because John had a bass and a drum machine. I had a guitar, I had effects, and I had a microphone and I had a 4-track.
There you go.
And John showed up at my house a couple days later and we wrote from phone.
That's awesome.
Yep. And that set the course. And we wrote quite a number of really marvelous songs that I still love to this day. Songs like This Sacred Place, The Beginning of the End, Restoration, Dismissal, Laura's Dead.
I assume Laura's Dead is a reference to your old band.
Yeah. I think that is because I liked what we did in Laura's Toy. But Laura's Toy really sort of fizzled out at the end. And when I was trying to get Lycia going, a couple of people that actually were liking what we were doing were still using Laura's Toy as a baseline to judge what we were doing. And I was feeling like, well, that's cool and everything, but I'm really more into what I'm doing right now. So why don't we just say Laura's Toy's dead and move on to this new thing? It was in no way or form a slam at Brian, the singer that we worked with, because I like Brian. I mean, I don't know. I have no idea what happened to Brian. He had some health problems and nobody has heard from him for a long time. And I'm very concerned that something bad happened to him. Because no one has heard from him. So, but anyways, the song was in no way negative towards him because Brian was a good guy, to me at least. He might not have been good to some of his former girlfriends, but he was a cool guy to me, and me and him were real good friends for a couple of years. And so it was in no way a slam towards him. It was more towards me just wanting to move forward with this vision that was working so well at the time. Because I'm telling you, when John first showed up, I think to a certain extent, we both were still in that mindset of trying to emulate our heroes. And so this might be of interest to people. Lycia's sound from that era really is a merging of two really different types of bands that John and I were listening to at the time. On one end, it was the Cocteau Twins and that big, lush guitar sound. But on the other side, both John and I were really into the Big Black Album songs about fucking. And we decided that we just wanted to sort of merge these two together. And if you listen to those early Lycia demos from especially late 88, you have this big lush sound, but it's dirty too.
Yeah.
It hints at a little bit of aggression. And once that style clicked, we never looked back. And we realized quickly that instead of us trying to sound like bands we liked, we'd write a song to sound like an earlier song that we wrote.
Oh.
And that just fed on itself. And so after about a couple of months, we suddenly had this very unique sound, and we never looked back.
That's
and
cool.
From that point on, I can honestly say that I never tried to make a song that sounded like another band.
Yeah.
I always tried to make a song sound like Lycia. And that's not to say that other styles didn't influence me, because like the Burning Circle was influenced by shoegaze. But I never said I want to sound like Slow Dive, or I never want to sound like My Bloody Valentine. I always said I want to do a Lycia song that evokes a similar type of atmospheric vibe.
Right.
So I never left the Lycia comfort zone from that point on. But yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, I think we've been talking for a while.
A long time.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you've got more you want to go over, or
No. I think that I'm in line for another podcast here soon with some other people.
Yeah.
So maybe they should watch this and they can feed off of this. But
True.
I'm a pretty aloof guy, and I'm private, and there are times where I'll go long times without talking, and I mope a lot and I pout a lot. But I can at times, because I'm an old guy, go off on the stories, and I do enjoy talking about it. I love talking about the old days because it makes me feel like I'm connecting with the old times, and I think I feel exceptionally connected to maybe some of the old times that were overlooked or not documented properly, because it sort of parallels maybe how my whole life has been, where
Right.
you know the behind the scenes stories about a lot of things in my life that I probably won't ever talk about in a public thing.
Right.
And that's the stuff that resonates with me. And so in a certain way, us talking a lot about the early days is, and it comes from sort of the same angle. But I wouldn't mind doing another one of these in the future where we maybe me and you talk about time in Ohio. We didn't really talk about that at all.
Yeah, we kind of stopped at the Burning Circle.
Yeah, because I think the time in Ohio, and in particular, the touring that we did, because when we lived up there, that's when we toured the most.
Yeah.
And it was also, the recording of Cold. There's a lot of stories around that, and the recording of Estrella, and even going into it's something that I don't really like to think about a lot, because it was such a strange period of time. But like the Empty Space time,
Yeah.
that might be interesting to go over that. What's that?
Tripping back in
the
days was a
that tripping. Even though we recorded that when we got back to Arizona, to me that really is the end of the line of Ohio. To me, Ohio is Cold, to tripping. They all sort of,
Yeah.
cold, a stray, and a tripping. Empty space is a sort of a bizarre anomaly to me.
Yeah.
But we can do that at a future one. So,
Yeah.
all right.
Cool.
Well, thanks for inviting me to things and shit.
I might have to change the title.
To things and shit.
I'll probably get, what do they call that? I can't think. Look, I've had like what, an hour and a half of sleep.
Yeah. Oh, one last thing. I gotta say this, man. There's only one of these beanies left out there.
Yep.
I absolutely love this beanie. Sage at Forest Passage, man, you did an insanely great job on this. So any of you out there that need beanies, I would go to him, or t-shirts.
Yeah.
I love this hat. If you like this hat, especially this flat one with no cuff, there is one left.
Yeah.
I'd go buy it now. It's probably going to be gone by the time this airs, because we're not going to make any more of these. We'll probably make some more cuffed ones, and because they were more popular, and maybe the floppy ones.
Floppy one.
Thank
you to everybody that bought them. I'm kind of shocked how fast it's been a week.
Yeah, it was pleasing to see how quickly they went, and I don't think you'll be disappointed with them. I really dig this.
Yeah.
So, but anyways,
coming up with some new stuff in the future.
Yep.
So some fun new stuff, purely because we want them for ourselves.
And in this forum too, me and Tara have talked about maybe bringing both Dave and John on to have them involved in some future ones. It would be really interesting to pick their brains on some of this stuff. Me and Tara talk about this stuff all the time because, well, we're married and we live in the same house. But it would be really interesting to hear their perceptions on things. And I think it would give some more insight about what makes Lycia tick. And
for sure.
So maybe some upcoming
shit and
version
stuff.
of shit and stuff, or stuff and shit, or whatever. We'll have maybe maybe all four of us and at the same time, or maybe it might be, I think it might be better if maybe it's me, Tara, and Dave, since we have mutual stories, and maybe Tara will just be the moderator for me and John, since me and John have a decade of history in the 80s and then on and off. So
it devolves into an online fist fight.
Okay.
That'd be awesome. I don't know why it would, but I'm just kidding. All right. Well, I guess we can get off here and actually go to sleep now.
Well, I still have a few more of these marvelous Four Peaks Hop Knot IPAs. I probably plan on drinking tonight, as well as this very festive Christmas cinnamon schnapps. So cheers, folks, and thanks for listening.
All right, bye.
Cheers.